A few years back, I found myself attending a boarding school in Singapore for my final 2 years of high school, or, as we called it, junior college. Being a practicing Catholic in a school where none of my friends shared my faith meant that I often attended Sunday Mass alone. Now, if you've ever been to Singapore, you'll know it's a fantastic place to explore solo. It's often even more enjoyable than going with others. So, going to Mass alone wasn't something that bothered me too much. However, on this particular Sunday, I was already feeling the weight of a looming week filled with submissions and tests. To add to my stress, I had somehow managed to oversleep, necessitating a splurge on a cab instead of my usual bus ride. With my monthly allowance dwindling, mostly spent on food, I was already feeling frazzled by the time I entered the church. I just wanted some peace amidst the chaos. Unfortunately, my appearance must have betrayed my inner turmoil, drawing the attention of a man standing a few feet away from me. He wore spectacles and sported a perpetual frown, a common sight in the predominantly Chinese congregation. Throughout the Mass, I noticed him glaring at me, but I chose to ignore him, unwilling to let his negativity disrupt my already troubled state of mind. As the only Indian student in my boarding school, I was accustomed to receiving curious or judgmental glances. It was a part of life that I had learned to navigate with patience and resilience. I'm not racist, but the comments I received from my peers and occasionally from teachers didn't help. The fact that my school and this church were situated in a wealthy neighborhood compounded the issue. I had never seen anyone who wasn't Chinese in that church, so being the only non-Chinese person there became a familiar experience. In short, I was accustomed to being a minority who attracted curious stares. I made a conscious decision not to dignify the man's negativity with a response. The incident that unfolded during Mass occurred during the distribution of communion when people often leave their seats. A spot near where the man and I stood became available, and I moved towards it, ensuring there were no elderly individuals who needed the seat. As I sat down, the man positioned himself behind me, and that's when I began to feel uneasy. His words weren't directed at anyone in particular. It seemed like he was speaking to himself. The solemn silence of the church only amplified his vitriol. Out of nowhere, he launched into a tirade about how Indians were supposedly ruining his beloved country. He accused them of engaging in illicit activities, overcrowding schools and hospitals, and transforming Singapore into a jungle. He advocated for the government to expel them all. He continued his diatribe, spewing a slew of derogatory remarks that I can't recall in their entirety. However, certain phrases stuck with me, like how he must have said prostituting at least 5 times, maybe even swapping it out for whoring once or twice. It was painfully clear that his words were directed at me. Initially, I turned to face him with a mixture of disbelief and indignation plastered across my face. His gaze bore into me, radiating nothing but pure hatred and rage. The discomfort of the people around him was palpable. I turned away, squeezing my eyes shut, silently pleading for him to cease his verbal assault. But the onslaught persisted. As his vitriol continued to assail my ears, I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. All I wanted was to flee from that place, to escape the torment, but fear held me rooted in my seat. I dreaded drawing attention to myself, afraid of becoming the center of a scene in a way I never wished to be noticed. The absurdity of the situation was beyond comprehension. Here we were, in the solemn confines of a church, with the priest still administering communion to the congregation. Yet in one secluded corner, a lone individual spewed hateful, racist vitriol at a 17-year-old, and not a soul intervened to silence him. When the priest returned to the altar, signaling the end of the service, I seized the opportunity to distance myself from the man. To my dismay, he trailed behind me. As the congregation began to disperse towards the exit, I hurried along, only to have him raise his voice, hurling insults and accusing me of unthinkable things. Finally, a woman nearby interjected, urging him to cease his verbal assault. However, her words rang hollow, for when I turned to her, hoping for support, she averted her gaze and swiftly retreated. Without further delay, I made my escape from the church, the memory of that harrowing encounter seared into my mind. Disoriented and panicked, I sprinted towards the exit of the church, my mind a whirlwind of confusion. I couldn't process what was happening, my thoughts a jumbled mess. Reaching the bus stop, I made a split-second decision to board the first bus that arrived, regardless of its destination. It seemed like a safe refuge, a haven from the chaos unfolding around me. As I fumbled to retrieve my phone from my purse, I sensed his presence looming behind me, an eerie echo of a horror movie scene. The only other occupants of the bus stop were a woman and a child, but I hesitated to approach them for help. With trembling fingers, I dialed my roommate's number, my voice trembling as I recounted the ordeal to her in a rush of panicked words. The stranger continued to advance towards me, his menacing presence unsettling the other bystanders. In a stroke of luck, a bus pulled up, and I hastily boarded, the doors closing behind me with a sense of finality. As the bus pulled away, I was engulfed by a wave of overwhelming emotions, grappling with the gravity of what had just transpired. Standing at the entrance of the bus, tears streamed down my face uncontrollably. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. I was engulfed in what felt like the worst panic attack of my life. The bus driver and passengers stared at me, their gazes laden with concern and confusion. At the next stop, the driver approached me, gently inquiring if I was okay. When I couldn't muster a response, he asked where I needed to go. With a trembling voice, I managed to give him the name of my school. A kind passenger who had just boarded the bus guided me off, explaining which bus I needed to catch. They even enlisted the help of someone waiting at the bus stop to ensure I boarded the correct bus. Eventually, I made it back to my boarding school. My roommate had been anxiously waiting on the other end of the call, her worry escalating with each passing moment. By the time I returned to our room, she had already alerted our mentor and reached out to the church in a desperate attempt to locate me. Unfortunately, they had no information to offer. This experience shook me to my core, and I couldn't muster the courage to return to that church for a long time. I want to make it clear that apart from this incident, I never felt unsafe in Singapore, nor do I believe that all people from Singapore harbor racist sentiments towards Indians. Nonetheless, this ordeal left an indelible mark on me, and I fervently hope to never find myself in a similar situation again.
Back in 1961, at the tender age of 20, I found myself joining the ranks of the Freedom Riders. Hailing from Boston, I was raised by two progressive Irish Americans who never let me forget our shared ancestry with the Kennedys. My father, a real estate lawyer by trade, harbored a deep-seated passion for constitutional law. It was as if he had personally penned the document himself. As I matured, I began to truly grasp the significance of the freedoms enshrined in our Constitution. This newfound understanding only deepened my indignation towards the Jim Crow laws prevalent in the South, and their stubborn defiance of Supreme Court rulings that upheld the rights of our African American brethren. It was during this pivotal period that I first learned about the Freedom Riders, a collective of predominantly college-aged individuals who embarked on Greyhound buses bound for the southern states. Their mission? To confront head-on the abhorrent systemic racism ingrained in the status quo. It was as if I had stumbled upon my life's purpose. The Freedom Riders felt like a modern-day embodiment of the Underground Railroad. Instead of waiting for justice to come to us, we were taking it directly to those in need, right in their own communities. However, our arrival in the South was met with anything but open arms. While we found allies among compassionate Southern Christians who genuinely upheld the teachings of their faith, our adversaries seemed boundless. Sometimes, distinguishing between the law enforcement and the vigilante groups fueled by Northern animosity was nearly impossible. They both acted with the same hostility towards us. Yet, while the good old boys resorted to fists and firearms, the police weaponized the legal system against us. They concocted baseless charges like trespassing and unlawful assembly to stifle our efforts. Even more unforgivable was their willful ignorance when we faced violent attacks from segregationist mobs. But what truly chilled my soul was the collusion between law enforcement and clandestine groups willing to carry out their most heinous deeds under the cover of darkness. They became the enforcers of brutality, doing the dirty work the police couldn't openly condone. By the summer of '61, the struggle had intensified, and our resolve was put to the ultimate test. The Freedom Riders catapulted into the spotlight following a chilling reception upon their arrival in Anniston, Alabama. Picture this: a serene Sunday morning disrupted by the sight of people, still clad in their Sunday best, abandoning church services to assault our buses. The driver attempted to flee, only to be thwarted by the mob, who slashed the tires and forced the crippled bus to a halt miles outside of town. Then, they hurled a firebomb into the bus, trapping passengers inside with intent to burn them alive. It was only the sight of a police officer brandishing a weapon that prompted the mob to retreat, allowing the riders a narrow escape. Such a harrowing welcome was exactly what we anticipated. We understood the risks, but our determination was unyielding. We took to heart the words of Thomas Jefferson, who spoke of the necessity to refresh the tree of liberty with the blood of patriots and tyrants. With this conviction, we embarked on the Greyhound journey from Newark to Little Rock, Arkansas. Surprisingly, the trip to Little Rock was relatively uneventful. Perhaps the overt hostility towards us, coupled with the presence of journalists, deterred the mob from repeating their violent tactics. However, upon reaching our lodgings, the Arkansas rider representative cautioned us against venturing out alone. A network of locals meticulously tracked buses arriving from the north, profiling and shadowing potential Freedom Riders, often with the collaboration of law enforcement and community volunteers. Their operation was alarmingly sophisticated, albeit morally reprehensible. What struck me as particularly cunning was their understanding that a group of college students couldn't remain holed up indefinitely. Eventually, we'd have to emerge for meals or necessities, and that's where their trap lay. It wasn't long before the allure of indulgence led to my downfall. One evening, hunger gnawed at me relentlessly. The meager packet of peanuts I had hoped would suffice proved laughably inadequate. Thus, I found myself meandering through the streets of Little Rock in search of sustenance. Yet I couldn't even make it to a fried chicken joint before the long arm of the law intercepted me. A single glance at my ID was all it took to seal my fate. They subjected me to a thorough pat-down on the spot, conveniently discovering a stash of marijuana in my jeans, a substance I had never laid a finger on. It was a blatant setup, but I was powerless to contest it. Ignoring the counsel of our representative, I had ventured out alone, only to fall victim to their devious ploy. My fury burned primarily at my own folly for falling into the trap of arrest, but it also seethed towards a system that could so easily label young individuals like myself as criminals. I had naively anticipated a brief stint in jail followed by possible expulsion from the state the next morning. Little did I know, the police had far more sinister intentions. It took me longer than I care to admit to realize they weren't headed to the local precinct. When the truth finally hit me, a terror unlike any I'd ever experienced gripped me. Instead, they whisked me away to an old, charred church, a place they claimed used to be a house of worship. It wasn't the thought of losing my life that chilled me to the bone, but the unimaginable horrors they might inflict upon me in that desolate place. I thought I had reconciled myself with the idea of losing my life. What truly petrified me was the cruel fate they had in store for me before the final blow. A fate orchestrated not by the police, but by a different, far more sinister entity. They had enlisted the aid of an organization devoid of morals, operating beyond the reach of oversight or mercy. Emerging from the woods clad in white robes, they exuded a terror far surpassing the mere specters they resembled, the Klan. Out of respect, I won't echo the vile words they spewed at me. Suffice it to say, their language was among the most repugnant I've ever heard. What's crucial to this narrative is their intent. They vowed to subject me to the same tortures inflicted upon Northern spies during the war. They looped a noose around my neck, dragging me through the woods as they delivered blows and kicks, all while chanting their deranged anthem of hatred towards the Yankee Nation. When they found a suitable tree limb, they hoisted me up, leaving me suspended in agonizing limbo. I lost consciousness at some point, for I have no recollection of the fall that followed. I awoke disoriented, my body aching, lying in a heap upon the dirt, the skin of my neck seared with pain from the ordeal. They dragged me onto the road, stripping me of most of my clothing, leaving only a noose still tightly cinched around my neck. With Little Rock as my only destination, they forced me to walk the long, lonely road back, the weight of their cruel message heavy upon my shoulders. I attempted to hitchhike, but it seemed people instinctively shunned me. There was only one group known for such atrocities, and they were not to be trifled with. My journey back into town felt interminable, the sun creeping towards dawn by the time I stumbled back to where the Freedom Riders were stationed. Initially met with suspicion, my accent served as my salvation, reassuring them of my allegiance. While I berated myself for my recklessness, others hailed me as a hero. An Italian fellow from Newark praised my audacity, likening it to having brass balls, a phrase etched into my memory as the ultimate tribute. In hindsight, I harbor no regrets for my actions. The Freedom Riders played a pivotal role in galvanizing public support and catalyzing the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Despite the terror I endured with that noose around my neck, it remains one of my proudest moments.